Most people are still shopping the way they did 2 years ago. Same list, same habits, same assumption that prices move the same way across the board. They don't. Some grocery categories are actually getting cheaper right now. Others are climbing fast enough that waiting even a few more weeks costs you real money. Nobody breaks it down item by item. So let's do that. This isn't about panic buying. It's about knowing which way each price is actually moving, based on USDA and government data, not guesswork. Some of what's coming up will probably surprise you, especially item number 7. Stick around for that one because it's the opposite of what most headlines are telling you. If this kind of breakdown is useful, subscribe because prices are going to keep shifting through the rest of the year and I'll keep tracking them. Let's get into it. Item number 1. Ground beef start with the one everyone already feels at the register. Ground beef. The US cattle herd is at its smallest size in decades. Ranchers cut herds during years of drought and expensive feed, and cattle take years to rebuild once numbers drop. That's not a supply problem that fixes itself in a season. Government data shows ground beef prices have climbed into the $6 to $7 per pound range, with year-over-year increases running in the low double digits. That's on top of similar increases the year before. Economists tracking the cattle industry say herd sizes aren't expected to recover meaningfully before 2027 or later. Because rebuilding a herd takes time, animals simply don't skip. If you eat beef regularly, this is the category where buying in bulk and freezing actually pays off. Split large packs into meal-sized portions before freezing so you're not thawing more than you need. This one isn't a scare tactic. It's a supply chain that takes years to correct, and prices are following that timeline. Item number 2. Coffee is next, and the number here is bigger than most people expect. The US grows almost none of its own coffee, so nearly everything on the shelf is imported. Tariffs on major coffee-producing countries, combined with poor growing seasons in some regions, have pushed prices up somewhere in the range of 19 to 25% over the past year. That's not a typo. Coffee is one of the biggest movers in the entire grocery basket right now, and it's tracked separately by USDA because the beverage category as a whole is rising faster than average. If coffee is a daily habit for you, whole bean or ground coffee both keep well in an airtight container in a cool, dark place for months, so stocking a few extra bags isn't wasteful the way some pantry items can be. Switching between store brand and name brand won't fully offset this one because the tariff and weather pressure hits the raw bean cost across the board, not just premium labels. Item number 3. Imported seafood shrimp, tilapia, frozen fish fillets. If it's frozen seafood from the freezer aisle, look at where it's actually from. A large share of US seafood imports come from China, Vietnam, and Chile, all of which are facing higher tariffs right now. Frozen seafood prices are already running well above the overall grocery inflation rate, with increases in the low double digits for some categories. Agricultural economists who track import data have flagged seafood as one of the categories most exposed to tariff policy simply because so little of it is produced domestically. Canned seafood is the quiet workaround here. Canned salmon, sardines, and tuna deliver similar nutrition to fresh or frozen imports at a fraction of the cost, and they're shelf-stable for years, not weeks. This is less about stockpiling shrimp and more about knowing which seafood aisle is holding steady and which one isn't. Item number 4. Fresh produce from Mexico: tomatoes, avocados, and berries. These 3 show up in almost every American kitchen, and all 3 are heavily imported from Mexico. Tariff policy on Mexican agricultural imports is one of the more direct price pressures hitting produce right now, layered on top of a California drought that's limiting domestic growing capacity as an alternative supply. Industry groups tracking food pricing have specifically called out fruits, vegetables, cheese, and seafood as categories to watch through the rest of 2026 because of this exact combination: tariffs plus reduced domestic growing conditions. Fresh produce doesn't freeze the same way beef or coffee does, so the practical move here is different. Buy what you'll actually use that week. Check frozen versions of berries as a lower-cost substitute, and watch for the weeks when domestic growing regions come online and prices ease temporarily. Item number 5. Imported olive oil and pasta. Staying with imports, olive oil and Italian pasta are both showing up on tariff exposure lists for 2026. These are pantry staples for a lot of households, and unlike fresh produce, they store for a long time, which changes the math on when to buy them. Olive oil in particular has less domestic production capacity to fall back on compared to something like vegetable oil, so price increases here tend to stick rather than correct quickly. Because both of these have a long shelf life, unopened, in a cool, dark place, this is a category where buying an extra bottle or box now, while prices are lower than they're projected to be later in the year, is a reasonable move rather than an overreaction. Item number 6. Sugar, candy, and baking staples. Here's one that surprised me when I actually looked at the numbers. Sugar and sweets are the single fastest rising grocery category tracked by USDA this year. Projections put the annual increase somewhere between 6 and 8%, well above the historical 20-year average for this category and above most other food categories being tracked. That covers more than candy. Baking sugar, cereal, flavored snacks, and anything built around sweeteners are all quietly moving up together, even when the individual price tags don't look dramatic week to week. Baking staples like sugar and flour store well for a long time in a sealed container, so if you do any regular baking, this is a category where a slightly larger pantry stock makes practical sense before prices climb further. Item number 7. Chocolate and cocoa. Now, here's the one I told you about at the start, and it's genuinely the opposite of what most people assume. Cocoa bean prices spiked to historic highs in 2024, and headlines about a chocolate crisis have stuck around since then. But the raw cocoa market has actually cooled significantly through 2026, with bean prices down sharply from those peaks as West African harvests recovered. Here's the catch. Chocolate companies locked in expensive cocoa contracts during the shortage, and many are still working through that higher cost inventory. So candy and chocolate prices on the shelf are staying elevated even while the raw ingredient cost behind them is falling. What that means practically, don't panic buy chocolate assuming shortages are still driving prices. The supply problem that started this is largely resolved. What you're paying for now is companies catching up on contracts signed during the expensive years, and that tends to ease over time rather than compound. This is exactly the kind of gap between the headline and the actual data that's worth knowing before you make a shopping decision. Item number 8. California. Grown produce and cheese. Back to a category directly tied to weather. California produces a huge share of the country's fruits, vegetables, and dairy inputs, and drought conditions there are limiting yields again this year. When a state that dominant in domestic food production faces reduced output, it doesn't just affect California prices, it affects the national average because there's less of a buffer against import costs elsewhere. Cheese, specifically, has been flagged alongside produce as a category facing upward pressure from this combination of drought and reduced domestic supply. If you go through cheese regularly, blocks generally last longer in the fridge than pre-shredded bags, and buying block cheese and shredding it yourself stretches your budget slightly further without changing what you're actually eating. Item number 9. Eggs. This one is the biggest reversal on the entire list, and it matters because most people still think eggs are expensive. They're not right now. After the severe bird flu outbreaks of 2024 and early 2025 that pushed a dozen eggs above $6 in some markets, producers ramped up flock sizes to catch up. That response has now created an oversupply, and egg prices have actually fallen more than 40% year over year as of early 2026, with a dozen eggs back under $2 in a lot of stores. Here's the part worth paying attention to. Bird flu hasn't disappeared. It's cyclical, and past outbreaks have hit hardest in fall and winter months. Producers are currently absorbing losses at these lower prices, which historically doesn't last. Practically, this is a genuine window. Eggs freeze reasonably well when beaten and stored in a sealed container, And if you bake or cook with eggs regularly, this is a rare case where a below-average price right now might not hold through the back half of the year. Item number 10. Frozen and shelf-stable staples. As a category, step back from individual items for a second because there's a pattern worth naming. Frozen vegetables, canned beans, rice, and pasta are consistently the categories with the slowest price growth across every USDA report this year. That's not an accident. These categories have longer, more flexible supply chains than fresh produce or imported specialty goods, so they absorb tariff and weather shocks more slowly. Building even 2 or 3 meals a week around these staples, instead of items pulled from the categories we just covered, is one of the simplest ways to keep your average grocery bill from climbing at the same rate as the headline inflation number. Item number 11. Restaurant and takeout spending. This isn't a grocery item, but it belongs on this list because the gap here is getting wider than people realize. Restaurant and food away from home prices are projected to rise faster than grocery store prices again this year, with food service inflation running close to a full percentage point above at-home grocery inflation. That gap compounds. Every time a beef, coffee, or produce cost increase hits a restaurant's supply chain, it shows up in menu prices with a markup layered on top, on every single order. The practical takeaway isn't never eat out. It's that the cost gap between cooking at home and ordering out is widening in 2026 specifically, so shifting even 1 or 2 meals a week from takeout to home cooking has a bigger impact on your budget than it did a year or two ago. Item number 12. Store brand versus name brand. Last one, and it's the simplest lever you have. Store brand and generic products. Retail and finance analysts tracking this year's grocery trends consistently point to the same move. Switching to store brand on staple items is one of the most reliable ways to offset category-wide price increases, because store brands generally absorb tariff and commodity cost increases more slowly than name brands do. This matters more in 2026 than in a normal year specifically, because so many of the increases we've covered, beef, coffee, sugar, imported produce, are structural rather than short-term spikes. A slower moving discount on a store brand adds up over months, not just one shopping trip. It won't offset everything on this list, but paired with freezing what you can, buying shelf-stable staples ahead of projected increases, and knowing which categories like eggs and cocoa are actually easing right now, it's the difference between reacting to your grocery bill and staying ahead of it. So here's the pattern across all 12 of these. Some of this year's price pressure comes from things that take years to fix, like herd sizes and drought. Some of it comes from tariffs that could shift with policy changes. And some of it, like eggs and chocolate, is actually moving in your favor right now, even though the headlines haven't caught up. Knowing the difference is what actually protects your budget, not buying everything in sight out of anxiety. Stock the staples that store well and are trending up. Ease off panic on the categories that are already correcting. And build a few more meals around the staples that barely move at all. Most people will notice these shifts 3 or 4 months from now, when the receipt finally forces them to. You don't have to be one of them. If this was useful, subscribe, because I'll keep tracking these numbers as they update through the rest of 2026. And drop a comment with which category surprised you most. Talk soon.